So here we are. I'm going to start recording. Great. So hello, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us.
So here we are.
Oh, hold on. I'm going to start recording. Great. So hello, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us.
So here we are.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm sorry. I'm
going to start
it's repeating myself, so I don't know how to stop this.
Right.
Give me 1 second. Okay. So I hope we are over the technical issues. Welcome to our 10th Critical Dialogue on Reconciliation. I am Mafe Olarte. I'm part of Embrace Dialogue, or Rodeemos el Diálogo. And today we will talk about the levels, outcomes, drivers, and the scaffolding necessary for successful reconciliation. This event, as some of you may know, is part of a series of dialogues organized by the Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, Embrace Dialogue, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, which seeks to promote multicultural interdisciplinary global dialogue about reconciliation. Also, we want to say that this year, Embrace Dialogue is celebrating its 10th year since its foundation, and we are delighted about our partnership with the University of Winchester and the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and also OxPeace. If you don't know us yet, let me tell you very, very briefly. Rodeemos el Diálogo, or Embrace Dialogue, is a Colombian peace-building organization promoting the culture of dialogue, and you will hear a little bit more about it in a while. We work in different aspects of peace building. In Colombia, we do work on transnational justice and peace pedagogy, also youth-led projects, among other things. And on a global level, we hold spaces like this dialogue. And we also think about how learnings from our work in Colombia can be applied to other spaces, and also how we can learn from other experiences in the world. So reconciliation is at the center of our work, and these critical dialogues are really important to us. Through the series of events, we will continue inviting practitioners and academics, decision makers, to share their research, policies, and activities around reconciliation processes. This is a critical issue, and a critical approach is needed to address the legacies of long-lasting divisions within and between societies around the world. In the chat box of this Zoom, I will post links where you can subscribe to our newsletter and also follow our work, as well as videos of previous critical dialogues that are in our YouTube channel. Once again, and on behalf of Embrace Dialogue and the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, welcome. Now I'm handing over to Dr. André Gómez Suárez, a senior researcher fellow at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and the co-founder of Rodeemos el Diálogo, who will convene today's dialogue and introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Mafe, and very welcome to everyone here in this space. And thank you, Carl, very much for joining us. I will introduce Carl properly shortly. It is good to see so many of you who have participated in previous dialogues. This is the idea of this series, that we have created a space for people to think together, and that doesn't happen overnight or in one session. It happens over regular meetings. So please, if you are a new participant, try to come to the next critical dialogues that we'll be doing. And you can also, as Mafe said, can watch the previous dialogues that we have held with other people from different corners of the world, talking about reconciliation in this critical time. The Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester shares the same vision that Rodeemos el Diálogo, or Embrace Dialogue, does, And that's the reason why we are very happy to have this partnership with Embrace Dialogue. We're also very happy to have OxPeace, that is a network of academics at the University of Oxford working on challenges and opportunities of peace building. The Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace believes in social justice and compassion to make a difference in the world. The center is the front line of the international work of the University of Winchester in peace and reconciliation and the fight for integrity and justice. Embrace Dialogue has 6 principles that align with peace and reconciliation and are the core for creating a culture of dialogue, the cornerstone of this event today. Let's be mindful of the following principles during the next hour and a half. First, generosity. We ask you to be fully present, to stop your thoughts, but nurture your thinking. Second, solidarity. We invite you to unleash the power of empathy. Third, co-responsibility. We invite you to hold this space together, to realize that it's in the interbeing that this emerges. Fourth, honesty. We invite you to speak from your own experience and also to be humble and recognize that we don't know everything, to be genuine. Fifth, respect. We invite you to see your own reactions to other people's assumptions and ideas and suspend your judgment, to embrace awe. And finally, self-criticism. We invite you to not confuse your assumptions with reality and be critical and open to change your mind, so to nurture your intellectual humility. These principles would allow us to sustain this dialogue today. We understand dialogue as a horizontal transformative process, which gets closer to what David Bohm thought of creating a strip of meaning flowing among and through us. So the invitation is to leave aside all patterns of interaction. This is not a seminar. This is a space for spontaneity, for us to think together and to see our individual patterns of thought and our inconsistencies. So today's dialogue will follow the following format. The first 30 minutes, Carl and I will kick off the dialogue. Lots of ideas will be left on the table for you to take it from there. Please don't drop questions or comments on the chat. Allow your own thought process to flow. See your own patterns of thinking while you are listening to us. I then will facilitate a collective dialogue for 45 minutes. We invite you to turn your camera on and voice your comments or questions. They don't need to be directed to Carl. We will let your ideas intermingle and flow for a while and then get back to Carl for a couple of times for him to add his own ideas to the dialogue. Please be aware, as Mafe said, that this dialogue is being live streamed on YouTube. I will then wrap up in 5 minutes, trying to offer some food for thought out of what has emerged in our dialogue to let the stream of meaning continue to flow after we leave this space today. So without further ado, let me introduce and welcome our very special guest today to this 10th Critical Dialogue on Reconciliation. Carl Stauffer is a senior expert on reconciliation for the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP. Before joining USIP, he was associate professor at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University. While in academia, Carl also functioned as an academic director of the Cause Scholar Program in Switzerland and co-director of the CER Institute of Restorative Justice. Prior to that, Carl served 16 years in South Africa, holding positions of regional peace advisor for the Southern Africa region, program director of the Africa Peace Building Institute, and education and training coordinator for the LESEMA Conflict Transformation Program. Carl has done consulting and training with organizations such as the UNDP, USAID, World Vision, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Asia Foundation, and Oxfam, and the government ministries of justice in Jamaica, the community development in Trinidad and safety, security, and land affairs in South Africa. He has worked with multiple transitional justice processes, including peace accords, community policy forums, truth and reconciliation commissions, collective trauma recovery, DDR and ex-combatant reintegration, reparations, memorialization, and local community development. Carl's academic interests include restorative and transitional justice, post-war reconstruction, and reconciliation processes. His research concentrates on a critique of transitional justice from a restorative and transformative frame and the application of hybrid indigenous community justice practices. Carr's most recent publications focus on positioning the restorative justice field as a transnational social justice movement. So we couldn't have a best guest today than Carl to start this incredible conversation about towards a social ecology of reconciliation. So with that in mind, Carl, why don't we start this conversation by asking you, what is reconciliation? And I know that this is, it seems like a small question, but in a field where there are so many different ideas about it, I think it would be really good to start with that. What is reconciliation, Carl?
Thank you, Andre. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And I see some wonderful colleagues and friends in the audience. Dumisani Ngwenya, so wonderful to see you online, and also Professor Simon Keyes and others. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to say, Andre, that question is you said simple, but it's also very, very complex, and why we are all here, actually. And so throughout my conversation, I'm going to try to answer your questions, but I'm also going to tell some stories. And so I think reconciliation is something that we have to experience and feel personally before we can try to understand it, or swimming in the water of reconciliation. And so it's a hard concept to talk about only at a theological or philosophical or theoretical level until we've gotten our hands in this work. And for me, that started early on in my life. I was born and raised in Vietnam and during the war. And so I always told my students and others this had some impact on what I'm doing today, I'm sure. I experienced the war as a child. And particularly in 1968, the war came into the city of Saigon, where my parents were living. My parents were with the church and doing humanitarian work, not the military. And so my parents refused to be evacuated in solidarity with the people they were working with. And so the fighting came within about a half mile of our home. So I remember the experience of war. But one thing that I tell people often is my father took a number of pictures after the war, that particular 1968 Tet Offensive. And one of those pictures was particularly graphic for me. And that was of a dead Viet Cong. That's a North Vietnamese soldier dressed in black, the dead body of one of the soldiers, and his feet were tied together, and he was being dragged behind in a military jeep. And people were on the streets watching, observing, standing by, cheering. But that struck a deep chord in my visual mind and in my heart as a child, and I really didn't understand it until I began to study this field of peace building as I entered that in my master's in 1998, and I began to really think about what was the impact of that, and what became very clear to me and became a driving mission, if you will, in my life was, when we have to celebrate our victory on the desecration of the enemy dead, we have lost a great deal of our humanity. And so what would it mean for us to restore that humanity? And for me, that's the essence of reconciliation, is restoring humanity through relationships. And I like to use the word social cohesion also as a way of trying to talk about reconciliation, because reconciliation, I know, is a trigger word. Let me say that up front. For some people, this is a painful word, maybe because you were forced into reconciliation, or there was religious reconciliation that was a coercive process, or another kind of reconciliation through a political, atrocities that felt like there was some kind of coercion or manipulation involved. And this makes reconciliation very painful, not to mention that in the English, means to reconcile, means to take relationships back to some sort of past relationship that might have been good. And in many situations between antagonists in a conflict, they've never had a good relationship to resort back to. And so in South Africa, during the Truth Commission, they used to say, we should call this the Truth and Conciliation Commission, not reconciliation, because we never were reconciled to the white settler. And so it's a challenge, but I think I still use the word reconciliation because it has deep roots in many traditions and many disciplines that we're involved in, and it still carries an umbrella understanding, as I said, about social cohesion. And so when I think about reconciliation, I don't think there's one definition. The definition I like to speak about is reconstructing or rebuilding social cohesion after violence at an individual, at a family, at a community, and a national level. But I also believe that it's more than that. The social cohesion concept at least has two aspects to it that I think are critical for reconciliation. The one is the narrative has to shift. The social narrative has to shift. The script of violence and the narrative around violence and revenge has to shift so that there's a critical mass of people who understand that no matter what has happened in the past, if we don't have the common good in mind, we will not survive. So there has to be some sense of the common good and a willingness to sacrifice your own individual wants or needs at times for that common good. The second piece is, and we're finding this more in practice, I believe, and that is that group of that critical mass who understands the common good also has to share, let me say, a future view where they can imagine that each of them has a role and a place to play in that future view. I'm not saying it would be one future view. I think that's a misconception that we can bring all the antagonists together and come up with one vision for the future, one narrative. No, it's a shared future view that allows for diversity and difference, but that everyone can imagine that they have a place in that future. If we can get to that place, I think we're looking at a more possible, sustainable reconciliation. And then finally, I just say this, and this is thanks to Dr. Simon Keyes and his incredible work, but I have found his three pillars, if you will, he may not use that language, the three facets of reconciliation very helpful. And that is the idea of dealing with the past. Second pillar, reconstructing new relationships and norms. And third, building towards more just societies. And those three are like, if you will, the three legs to a stool of reconciliation.
Thanks, Carl. That's very comprehensive and challenging understanding. You've put heavy concepts here. You've spoken about social cohesion. You've spoken about narrative shifts. You've spoken about a shared interconnected future. You've spoken about dealing with the past. I mean, like all of these really important elements. What is the challenge that you see in reconciliation when dealing with the past? Could the past become an obstacle for imagining that interrelated, shared, fair future? To what extent, how do we get into that dealing with the past to make sure that we come to the other side and don't get stuck there? And how does reconciliation deals with that challenge?
And of course, this is the crux of the challenge of our work. In many cases, though, there's much more. I think we have tended to become obsessed with the past sometimes too, and it doesn't allow us to move forward. I think in the broadest scheme, we can be grateful that we have moved into this idea that whole nations or countries need to deal with their social political past. Up until really, you can say almost World War II, we had very little understanding or propagation of that concept. It was, when one political entity overtook another political entity, it was a victor vanquished. It was the winner loser, and no one cared. If you lost, you lost. You find your own way, and the winner takes all. And so I think, with the Nuremberg trials and so on, we began to have a more global conscientization to this idea that we have to deal with the past. I say to folks, it's like when we talk about individual counseling and we want to get help for maybe traumas we've experienced as a child. The whole counseling experiment is based on the fact that we can talk about the past. We have to go back and recall the hurt before we can begin to figure out, how do I re-narrate and how do I live my life differently so that I'm not attached to this past. Now, there's a lot of controversy about converting that to a collectivized, national psyche. Is there such a thing as a national psyche? Is there such a thing as a global or a whole group of people, a nation state having some kind of sense of conscientization around this? This is a challenge. We're not sure. I don't think there's any real proof either way. But I think we do understand within sociological terms that social narratives construct our realities, and and those narratives can either be positive or destructive. They can either be constructive or destructive, and we know of the power of those narratives. And we also understand that when people get together and mobilize and organize, and there's a critical mass, the attitude, the cultural attitude, can shift in a nation state or a group of people. And so that's, I think, what we're trying to base this idea of dealing with the past in the broader sense of like reconciliation or transitional justice processes. Now, the dealing with the past can come in many forms. And I think the biggest challenge is just knowing the truth. And this is one of my critiques of transitional justice is we've had a great emphasis on the right to truth, which I think is important. People need to know the truth. We've known from the very beginning of time that when there's been an injury, people want to know the facts. The victim survivors want to know the facts and understand what happened in order to make sense of it. And it's the same with collective nations who've experienced atrocities, I believe. And so this, but truth in and of itself is not the healing. And I think we confuse that. We think if we can just give people the truth, then all will be well. No, truth can be used in so many different ways. Truth can be used to badger the other side on the head. The truth can be used to raise up old revenge cycles. Truth can be used to manipulate and disrupt political processes and to change the dynamics in a social cultural sense, and so in a negative way. So we need to be very careful around truth. So I say truth is really important, but truth for what purpose? And as we think about that, then I'm also concerned about the fact that truth, as each side owns its truth, there still needs to be a truth that allows everyone to come together. And this is what we don't have a handle on. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission preamble talks about 4 truths. It says there's a forensic truth. That's the truth of what happened. On this day, this group of people were massacred in this village at such a time. By who? This is the forensic truth, or exhumation of bodies and mass graves, etc. The second is a personal truth. All of us have a personal experience of the violence, and that story becomes really critical to our understanding of making meaning. And so we have to listen, we have to hear that story too, which is why victims' hearings and so on, survivor hearings are really important. The third is the one that we have the most hang up with, and that is the political truth, the social political truth. And that is a kind of political cosmology, if you will, that says a political narrative that says this is why we do what we do, and how we do what we do, and how we understand human nature, and so on, so like, and the politics of ideology and all of that. But then they mentioned a fourth truth, which I find very fascinating, and I don't think we have enough research on that. And they said there's such a thing as a healing truth. And so I wonder, what is a healing truth? Maybe I should throw that out to our group gathered here. What is a healing truth? For me personally, I don't know. What I believe from my experience is it is some sort of combination of all three of the truths before them. It is a combination of we need to know the forensic truth. The forensic truth is important, but it's not enough to heal or to satisfy us. Our personal truth needs to be acknowledged. We need to understand that, you know, what happened to us is not acceptable and not right, and that we as humans were violated in a way that's a violation globally. And then the political truth has to be able to hold together diversity and multiple truths, and not be threatened and closed down or shut down or silenced. And this is the challenge for the new political spaces that we're trying to find, whether you call that democratization or whatever, which is an overused word too, but those spaces for people to be engaged completely. So healing then takes all of those and brings them together, but in such a way, again, let me say, the crux of reconciliation is that we have to find a common enough place for us to live together and to imagine living together into the future. So coexistence.
That's brilliant. You have already put forward a question for our participants to be thinking about it, you know, for the next 15 to 20 minutes, and it'd be really great to hear whether, you know, they agree or not with you, or what they have other thoughts of what healing truth means. And I think this discussion, this way how you've been talking about truth is so important. I mean, you're right. You know, is one of the big topics in the field. I mean, we think about John Paul Lederach, for example, talking about, you know, the meeting place, and one of those elements that meet in the meeting place is truth. And I think when you mention Simon's work on, you know, like the three moments, we had in one of the previous dialogues, we had Rachel Clark, one of the authors of the Conciliation Resources briefing on reconciliation in peace building practice. And they were talking about this, you know, sort of complex space of reconciliation or reconciliation processes, in which they were bringing some of these ideas put forward by Simon of, you know, dealing with the past, then creating new social norms that is more like the social contract. How do you this vertical reconciliation? Then you have this creating like a social cohesion, not better interaction between communities or sectors of society. And then the other important element is envisioning a different future, a common future. So all of those elements were put there together. And I want to ask you the next question that has to do with, but you have come up with a new idea. And now, so you started talking about social ecology, and you know, so we now understand a bit what reconciliation is. How you understand reconciliation. We understand how it's connected to these complex processes that we have been put here. We see that many others have tried to conceptualize that in a framework, but you are saying no. I want to think about this through the lenses of social ecology. Could you help us understand what do you mean by a social ecology, so that we can start putting the pieces together in your way of thinking about this.
Sure, and this may be a little abstract for a bit, but hold with me. I think, well, let me say this, let me be very honest. Social ecology could also be academic jargonism, so I'm happy to be taken on that. It sounds nice. You know, maybe we don't always know what it means. But let me say how I've used it for years now. Actually, since about 2002, 2004, I've been working with the idea of how in the peace building and reconciliation field can we borrow from ecosystems, natural systems. I'm concerned that, well, less and less now, but in just a few decades ago, we were more obsessed with the mechanical systems. And we often we tried to make analogies between social networks and social systems and like computer motherboards or something like that. When any of us who've gotten our hands dirty into peace building and reconciliation work know that it never looks like a linear, it never looks like a motherboard of a computer. It looks more like an explosion, you know, when it comes to human interaction and conflict and the networking and the relationship challenges and context. So I remember reading in 1996 in around ecosystems, there was this quote, but whether large or small, simple or complex, no organism lives alone. Our survival and well-being depend on ecological relationships throughout the world. And so I began to think about this in the sense of a number of key themes: interdependence, and whole books. Let me say, for any of you who are familiar with Dr. Fanny Dutoit's work, he came out with a book in 2018 where he's looking specifically, and I think it's very profound, in the idea that reconciliation is dependent on an understanding of interdependence. Until we as humans begin to understand our interdependence, not just if we share the same state or the same region or whatever, or the same neighborhood, but also this broader sense of a human connection, of interdependence. I think complexity theory is teaching us a lot about this also, and the idea of you know, movements, social movements, is teaching us how do people who mobilize social networks move and make change and morph, and so these are all things that are feeding into this. But when you look at an ecosystem, I find that particularly stimulating to talk about an ecosystem. And there are at least 6 elements of a peace ecosystem. One is the sun, which is an incredible centerpiece of energy in an ecosystem, and the ecosystems would not live without the sun. And for me, that's the spiritual dynamic of our work. I think reconciliation in its many levels is a very spiritual enterprise, but we can talk about that in whatever form we want to. The second is the rain, the need for the watering. And for me, this is an analogy of a sense of cleansing. And this is where the healing aspects of our work, I think, need to come in, cleansing and purifying. And we have ancient rituals and indigenous practices that often use water as a way, and many of our religious traditions use water as an example of cleansing or purification. We have then the plant life, the greenery, the trees, and this is all health and vitality in many ways. It is creation and procreation, and this green plant life fills a space and feeds the sun and the rain. The sun and the rain feed that plant life, and the plant life also gives oxygen for us. And so it's that vitality of the process. And then there's the decomposing of the system. When something dies, it decomposes and goes back into the ground and enriches the soil and so on. And I think we need to think about this in life and death, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about this peace building work. And what is regeneration? Regeneration, like, what does it mean to think about working for peace for the next generation? Maybe we will never see it in our lifetime, but what does it mean to pass something on that's going to be, helping to shift justice or peace building paradigms in the future? The soil is that nutrition. What are all the aspects of the system that we need nutrition? The plant life needs that soil for, and so that's it's a planting place. It's an anchoring place. What is that? Many of us, I think, in indigenous practices, teaching us over and over again that all of this work is embedded in deep relationships, deep networks, and we have to figure out how to maintain those networks. And then there's the rivers and the streams, which are not just the rain that cleanses and purifies, but they have deep water sources that provide wisdom, that provide, they also keep the soil, in its ability to continue to regenerate itself. Now, that all is very, very fine and very, very scientific or biological or ecological. I think, when we think about that, there's many analogies we could make from those. But I like to imagine a peace ecosystem as an integrated system where the sun or the spiritual dynamic feeds into, first of all, a kind of healing or a cleansing. That's where the rain comes in. And then there comes a time where we have to start to plant for sustained peace. And so that's where the trees and the greenery come in. And then there comes a time when these life cycles and there's death. And what does it mean when that death comes? And how do we regenerate? For me, sometimes nonviolence becomes the regeneration. There's been a moment where this peace and reconciliation has stalled or died. And nonviolent strategic action becomes a way of regenerating. And we see this out throughout history, regenerating a call for justice and for human rights and for all of that, which becomes the nurturing soil to then sustain that plant life along with the rivers and streams, and then that drawing from the sun for another sustained period. And this cycle goes on and on. Now, some of the complications in that, the forces are food supply, for instance. Food supply can be cut off and those ecosystems can die, and that has humanitarian, and there's climatic disasters, which natural and environmental feed into this. There's disease, health hazards and disease that comes in, and we understand violence as, from a public health perspective, as a public pandemic. It's a disease pandemic. Violence spreads similar to a viral process like COVID or something like that. And then you've got the competition within those ecosystems of one element of the ecosystem competing with another, and then they eventually choking each other out or squeezing each other out or killing. There's predation. We have to work with predation. What happens in the food line, when someone is food for the next person, the predator and the prey? This is part of our conflict problem and process and what we're always working with. And it's also in the natural phenomenon. So what can we learn? And there's parasitism that kills ecosystems, which can be an analogy of covert structural corruption or violence and oppression. So there's many ways to look at it. Let me finally finish with this. There is three factors that help to build ecosystems. One is coevolution. And coevolution is the idea that one species adapts to another so that they can survive together in the ecosystem. And so this is where you might want to call this compromise or whatever, this social cohesion, this future view where we can be together and co-evolve together. And our attitudes and behavioral activities that cause the violence those narratives can hopefully be transformed. And then there's this idea of ecological succession, a process where the ecosystem can slowly change incrementally, bit by bit, and over a long period of time. And so this might be the decadal thinking of how do we change structures into, when we want to talk about building just societies, we have to think 5, 10 decadal thinking in order to see that kind of transformation happen. And then there's climax community. This is the process whereby an ecosystem reaches a plateau of harmony and order, which can be sustained for a significant period of time. Now that's our goal, but that's an ideal, and rarely do we get there, unfortunately, so far. I'm going to stop. I've talked enough for sure.
It made me think again, listening to you, a bit of, the important role, and we were discussing this with Simon this week, the important role of metaphors in the work that we do, how these analogies that we use, help condense our thinking that sometimes gets very, and I think it's very inspiring to talk in this way about these things. So before we open the floor for other people to start bringing their ideas of what they have been thinking about during the last, say, 30 minutes, let me just ask you, while you were talking, I felt that there were moments in which you were going beyond reconciliation. So you were talking about the ecosystem of peace. So is there a specificity of reconciliation and a social ecology of reconciliation? Where is reconciliation in this complex ecosystem that you are talking about? And it seems to me that from what you were suggesting in different moments also, is like reconciliation is an ecosystem within an ecosystem. So it's like, but so when we are thinking in terms of a social ecology of reconciliation, what is the invitation that you are making to us, to the people, to practitioners, to academics? What is the invitation in particular that you're making for those reconciliation practitioners or academics to do in order to improve either their practice or their thinking about reconciliation, and that they don't get lost in this? And I'm asking you this because yesterday I was running, we have our MA option on reconciliation and peace building, and we were reading about the paradigms on reconciliation, and we were reading Leather at the Meeting Place, we were reading Hamber and Kelly, A Working Definition for Reconciliation, Andrew Schaap, Political Reconciliation, Verdeja and Chopping Tree, Keys Mapping of Reconciliation, and all of these. And at some point, one student said, I'm confused. I don't know what is the limit between peace building and reconciliation. So in a way, I think, what is the specificity of all of these for people who are thinking, okay, this social ecology of reconciliation is a useful term for me to think about and also to do practice on reconciliation?
That's really important. And yes, there's a lot of blurring, and I'm aware of that as we, being a peace builder practitioner, as well as a reconciler and other kinds of activity. So let me just say, over the last year and a half since I've been at USIP, one of my tasks was to look at an evidence review of the field of reconciliation, and many, many voices have fed into that, and I've appreciated that conversation very much. And there are many really, really wonderful minds that have thought through these various paradigms as you're talking about of reconciliation. And so it's very hard to in any way sort of try to bring them all together. But in a globalized sense, I worked on what I believe is a reconciliation matrix, what I'm calling a reconciliation matrix that could help us as we think about our practice, as well as policy sort of ideas around reconciliation and how we're getting to where we go. Again, this is globalized. This is not highly specific, so people will want to maybe ask more questions in that. And there's nothing new about this per se. This is a gathering of multiple ideas and voices and bringing them together. And so I start with, in the matrix of starting with what, because one of the things we have to ask ourselves in the field is, what are we trying to accomplish? So I'm starting with outcomes. I'm doing a backwards thinking, a backwards planning process. So the outcomes. And for me, there are three main outcomes of, and two of these are very close to what Simon Keyes was mentioning before. The first outcome is individual and collective healing. And I know this is very dangerous territory to get into because healing is a hard thing to measure. There's lots of controversy around what is healing, what does it look like at a collective level, especially. So, but I'm not ready to let go of that because I think healing comes in many different forms. It's specifically healing, ing. It's not being healed, it's healing, it's a journey. But there has to be a certain level of letting go of the pain and the terrible consequences of the outgrowth of traumatic violence. There has to become at some point a collective and an individual letting go, not letting go as in forgetting, but letting go as in I can now place this atrocious narrative and what happened to me, this experience, I can place it into a schema of my life that has meaning beyond that trauma. And that trauma is one thing. And that I am now going to concentrate on post-traumatic growth, as we call it in the field. And that's this idea that I'll never forget what happened to me, but I can go on. And one of the best gifts I can give myself and society is to go on. I remember there was a Time magazine interview with a young child soldier from Cambodia. And the journalist was clearly wanting to get a juicy story. So he was like, after everything they did, the Khmer Rouge had killed his family and burnt the village. He said, after everything they did, don't you want revenge? And this young boy, very, very smart young man, said, yes, I do. And so the journalist really thought he was onto something. And he said, so what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to live my life to the fullest and the best that I can. And I'm going to make the most of my life. And that's my revenge. And so there's this movement. And so it's at a personal and intragroup level. And it borrows a lot from trauma-informed field and the new neurosciences. And I'm pleased to say there's a growing body of knowledge on how to do this at a community-based level where you don't require professional accredited therapy. And that whole communities can move through processes in small groups, and then they keep multiplying those and help to bring relief in some ways around trauma and healing. And so what I do in the matrix is I move from the outcomes then to some theories of change. That's part of our field, also very controversial, and I'm not wedded to theories of change, but we use that language and we use it in our funding. And so I've tried to write some more global theories of change that might drive some of these outcomes. And then I give some sampling of practice mechanisms and skill sets and competencies required in this process. So that's the one layer. This is this individual collective healing. And to answer and to say about the past, I think that dealing with the past is part of that healing, but that the healing is the overarching goal. Second level is at a communal level. Peaceful intercommunal relations is the most general way I can say it. And a colleague of mine in South Africa once described a project that we were doing called on video dialogues and reconciliation as interlocking spheres of facilitated dialogue. And I think that, Rodeemos el Diálogo is doing exactly that. And this is critical. And I don't think it's only critical during the conflict or after the conflict as a post-war experiment for a few years. I think this is the bread and butter, the networking of what a good society, a democratic, or whatever you want to call it, a society where people are free to express opinion and to work together, but also to live together, and where there's, as I mentioned early on, this common good. And so however we can keep spheres of dialogue going throughout all levels of society and on different topics and different subject matters, and make this part of how we change and grow as communities and as neighborhoods and as churches or religious organizations and as families. This is critical. And so this is very much the horizontal reconciliation that's often talked about in the theory. And it borrows a lot on social networking and dialogue processes, sustained dialogue processes. And then the third outcome, and I'll stop here at this point, is this idea of construction of just societal institutions. And I know institutions is not always is also a contested word. The whole idea of our current sort of nation state is a contested process. That's another conversation. Right now, we're working with this idea that we have certain social and political institutions in place, whether we like it or not, that try to help with governance and our relationship. And so this is this vertical reconciliation between the citizenry and those who govern them. And in this place, I think we need to bring in knowledge from restorative justice and transformative justice and bits of redistributive justice here. And so I'll end with this. Restorative justice, in my opinion, as I've studied it, can provide us, it has the principles, the practices, the values that could provide us the bridge between reconciliation and justice, a practice bridge. And that's one of the big gaps that we're struggling with, is where does justice fit in reconciliation? And every time we send surveys out and talk and interview about reconciliation, people say, but justice has to be there. So what is the relationship between reconciliation and justice? I think restorative justice is beginning to give us that bridge. And I'll stop at that point.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carl. I think we have lots of water into this stream that we are trying to create here. And I think we have put lots of elements on the table, and we have 25 people in this room who have been listening to some of the ideas that you've been putting on the table, some of the questions that I've been asking, and some of the ideas that I've been putting on the table. But this wouldn't be an enriching dialogical process if we could not hear from other people in this space and to take either their questions, their comments, their concerns, what they have been thinking about it while we've been talking. So I open the space for you to intervene. Please indicate if you would like to be calling into the room and turn your camera on in order to ask your question or make your comment to contribute to this stream of meaning that we are building here. Mafe.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. It really was enlightening. And I've been struggling with this idea of healing. As I mentioned to you before, I'm an anthropologist, and one of the things I do is anthropology of health, or medical anthropology, and I'm looking at searching for forcibly disappear people, and everything, or not everything, but most of it is about trauma, PTSD. But there's another stream of thought who think, okay, we need to move away from this understanding of this as trauma and people needing to heal. But then listening to you and your take on it as healing and not heal or healed, I think it helped me a lot, because then one of the things I kept thinking is, if you have somebody who's been disappeared and you don't find the remains or the person alive, you are in a constant state of mourning. That's it. So how can you pretend to heal or be forced to heal or be expected to heal? But then when you put it in the present tense, in the present continuous, then what made me think about is that some wounds cannot be healed, but they can be cared for. And that's where this community support, well, the individual part, but also the community bit that you were mentioning just now, comes in. And then I can see these as communities of care who care for one another, and help each other healing. And we don't know where this will go, but it's I just want to thank you for that, for allowing me to bring in the healing bit. And another thing that it's more of a question, I really enjoyed your explanation of the ecosystem and the other thing that I've been thinking about is how sometimes for people it's also really tough, and I don't know if this is a question for people working in reconciliation, the difficulty to reconcile with the territory where they have suffered so much. So not only the people who caused the harm, but also being there in a place that constantly reminds you of what you have suffered. So how, if at all, the territory comes in as a fundamental part of where people live.
Thanks, Mafe, for putting that on the table. Let's see if someone else would like to jump in so that this doesn't become a Q&A, and so that we also have more space to reflect on the new ideas that have been brought on the table. Simon, please come in. You've been named quite a lot today. So it'll be good to hear you. Could you turn your camera on? Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Carl, that was a really, really stimulating presentation. So much to think about there that my mind is actually in a whirl, because you've opened up so many interesting possibilities. Really, so wonderful. And you know, we've obviously been in contact with each other, and Andre is part of this. So these ideas about ecosystem and the past versus the future, you know, are very live for us at the moment. So a couple of thoughts. I thought, Mafi, what you just said is, have I pronounced that right, Mafi? Anyway, a minute ago, was really interesting. This thing about healing, because I'm just increasingly interested in what we actually mean by healing. That there's a kind of, the word itself can't escape the sort of medical connotations of some intervention that makes people better, and that somehow they recover from and are sort of returned to health. And when we're talking about the kind of trauma that Mafi was mentioning, and you know, the huge damage that conflict does, it's really hard to think in those terms of recovery, I think. But I think that healing is something a bit, could be something a bit different, which is about change, becoming different, changing your relationship to the future, changing your sense of identity. And so I wonder when, because I think an awful lot of work has gone into the kind of, you know, trauma response approach to reconciliation, and the results are not hugely dramatically encouraging in some respects. I don't think we don't see massive transformations or massive recoveries of people. People have to learn to live with pain and difficulty, and this requires them to think differently about themselves and to think differently about the future, shift their identity, and somehow let go of things from the past that have defined them up to this point. It's very easy to talk about in these abstract terms, but I would really be interested in hearing people how they understand the word healing when it's used in connection with reconciliation. I'll stop there. I've got lots of thoughts on ecosystems as well, but I don't want to overload things. So what do we really mean when we're talking about healing in this context?
Thank you, Simon. Brilliant. I know we can see the scaffold. I mean, you know, the stream flowing and flowing. I can see now that Angela would like to make a comment. So, Angela, please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you indeed.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very stimulating discussion. I myself am not in the discipline or field of reconciliation, but I have worked a lot in the conflict and humanitarian. And I'm struggling because I'm coming from a particular concern with an area and a country that I've been very involved in, namely in Ethiopia. I have been involved with Ethiopia since childhood. I've studied it, worked there, been involved there, write about it, and still follow it. And I'm about to go back there in a month's time. And I'm finding the discussions very pertinent because, as you know, right now, there is unfortunately enormous conflict going on in many parts, as well as drought and issues of climate change, etc. And also various attempts at creating national dialogue and, you know, working towards something. And I'm thinking about what you've been saying, and I'm thinking about it in terms of, you mentioned social cohesion, and I was thinking, yes, before that, we have to understand the social suffering that went on, which is very broad. I mean, it's political, it's social, it's psychological, it's cultural, it has very, very deep roots. The conflicts are just sort of, you know, periodic outbreaks where all these suffering has come together and broken out. And this particular conflicts, you know, has a precedent before in the past, all to do with both unresolved issues of state formation, identity, and all the things that you've mentioned, as well as, you know, the particular social and physical suffering of what is been happening right now. And I'm thinking, I think it was James Baldwin who said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And therefore, part of the dialogue process, you know, is this very painful thing that you've all mentioned of how do we face all the things that we want to change, and how do we face them in a manner that is, as your organization is suggesting, you know, respectfully. How do we listen? How do we recognize, first of all, the different perspectives and what has happened? And so how do we go, because a lot of also peace building, you know, is seen as a sort of a project. So now NGOs and, you know, the UNDP and political affairs, you know, it's another project that people raise money for, and you intervene, you go to a country and you are setting up the peace building process, you know, and it's a sort of an external, you know, here are the experts, they're flying in. Whereas, I mean, your very brilliant presentation, Carl, I was thinking, this is what everybody there, in this case, you know, should be discussing, not us. You know, I mean, these are the processes that people who are being involved in dialogue, and then the dialogue itself. I mean, in many countries, people are chosen to do national dialogue. You know, you sit in an office and your names are put on the newspaper that so and so and so and so, and you know, here is this huge group of 100 or 50 or 150 or 25 people who will do dialogue for you, you know, and the rest of the population is kind of sitting there listening. So I'm just throwing these out. I don't have a question. I'm just very grateful for what you're saying, but I'm just, you know, struggling that how does it go from project to process, and how does the process itself become very, very inclusive and then how does it draw on traditional, because every country is very contextual. Even in Britain, we we need dialogue at the moment, but we can draw on traditional methods, spiritual method, faith, everything. Anyway, just to say thank you very much, and
thank you.
Continue.
Thank you, Angela. I think I've seen another hand up, but I think we can wait for a second, and then I'll bring you, Dr. Leo. I'll bring you in a second, but I think here in this moment it'd be good to try to bring Carl a bit also to reflect, and then probably more people could put their hands up. I just wanted to respond also in a way so that we thread this, and then I hand over to Carl. To Angela, to some of the things that she was saying, and I think embrace dialogue is a really good example of the opposite, a process that to survive has to start to do projects. But then you have the next challenge, and is how do you don't end up just doing projects? That is the only way of the economic survival of the organization. So how do you keep the process going? And that's the reason why Embrace Dialogue, for example, is an organization that 90% of the work that does is on a voluntary basis, so that we don't lose the ethos of the process of the things that we do. And the other thing are the projects that can keep the organization sort of going, and a group of the organization going. And sort of this is important because the only way you get the volunteers, and the organization was set up in London, but actually today it works in Colombia with volunteers from the cities who are affected by conflict or where they want to see the change that they want to see. So they are engaged in transforming the reality with what they have. So in a way, you keep opening that space for dialogue. So that was like an initial reaction that I just wanted to throw, how these sort of things are sort of, I understand the challenges, and that's the 10 years down the line, we keep thinking about, how do you keep that process going? And I think that that's the reason why also we have opened these spaces for people in other countries, in other regions, to realize that dialogical process, that you only get good at dialogue by doing dialogue. I mean, it's like, how do you get good at running? How do you get good at seeing the other person's perspective? By sitting in a dialogue and forcing and sort of nurturing that curiosity on listening to the other without judging. But that's a tremendous exercise. It's like getting better at meditating. And you start with very little things. I love this idea of what Carl was mentioning of granularity, small things that end up sustaining and creating a big change. That's one thing. And the other thing, Carl, that I wanted to drop here that I think is interesting, bear in mind the conversation about social healing, is that yesterday, by chance, I found this book by John Paul Lederach in our library at the university. And Simon would like this, and probably some of you would like this. Where he's talking about social healing. And when he talks about social healing, he says, but I'm going to talk about social healing from an oral understanding of change and movement. So you have to see social healing as the voices that are put into the air, and then they disseminate as the sounds of things that evolve, that they are not rational, but it's like a movement that cannot be captured. So social healing, in a way, is not a process, but is a cycle of movements that happen between different sectors of society. And his claim is that social healing is a step in between individual healing and reconciliation. I don't know whether you would agree with that or not as part of this, but this is a bit of the things that he was saying in this book that I thought could be interesting for the dialogue that we're having now. So Carl, over to you to see where all of this is taking you, and then we will do another round of thoughts.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I'm really interested in the continued rounds. These are really, really stimulating thoughts, and so thank you. I really do want to say something about the land and the geographical space. I don't really have a lot on that, but I think Mafe, you're saying what you're talking about is really, really very, very important. There's two aspects to it. Some people have been forced out of their land, out of their space, out of their country. And we know this is migration and all of that. And that's a kind of other trauma. And forcibly relocation. And I think we're just beginning to understand the trauma impact, the generational trauma impact of that. And then there are many places that have experienced severe conflict, but they have no place to go. They are living beside each other, even in situations where a neighbor to neighbor has killed each or harmed each other. And so reconciliation becomes really, really critical in both of those types of settings, but it's a different kind of reconciliation probably. For those who've had to leave, often their trauma gets frozen from the time they left. And so when we think about diasporas and stuff like that, often their trauma is frozen from the time they left, and they don't see the incremental changes that have happened since. And so there's a different kind of work we have to do to help them think through how the conflict has changed since they left. But those on the ground who live right where the conflict happened, I think we can't underestimate. And this is where memorialization, this is where drawing on all the social, spiritual, cultural resources that those people have to bring a different narrative and to re-narrate and bring a new meaning to this is critical. And this is again where I'm so challenged by indigenous processes, or whatever word you want to use, traditional indigenous processes. And I don't want to glorify them. Many of those processes may be dangerous and could be hurtful and harmful too, but many of them have over eons of time developed really important ways of social healing that you're talking about here. And for us to look back to those and not necessarily try to recreate them as they were, because life has gone on, but look at hybridized models to say, what can we take from here and put together that are the strengths of an indigenous and also complement it with some, if you will, more westernized or northernized or external processes. And I think that's starting to happen. But I think the key there is that that we restore those rituals and ceremonies and memorialization that helps people redeem the land, so to speak, redeem the geographical space. And just like they have to change the meaning in their own personal story, their narrative, they also have to find a new meaning collectively and about the land. And so it's the kind of idea of seeing where in Japan, in a southern city where for the 50s, the industrial corporations dumped mercury into a fishing bay and it destroyed the fish. And then the fishing was the primary mode of survival of the people. And it was a generational destructive thing. And they were finally able to hold the government accountable. The mercury dumping stopped after 10 years, and then the cleanup stopped after that. So this was decadal work, but eventually now the water is cleaner because they've put in all these processes than the rest of the water, like in Tokyo Bay and so on. And so Minamata is the name of that fishing village, an incredible reconciliation and memorialization process, as well as a geographical process of cleaning the land. But there's a lot to say on that. Simon, thank you so much. I think you're onto something on recovery. I remember Howard Zehr, who's a founder of the restorative justice field, did quite a bit of work with interviewing victims and survivors of crime. And he asked them the language that they like, and he tried out different language. And one of the things we often hear is closure, trauma closure. He said 100% of the victims and survivors he talked to hated that word. They're like, there is no closure. For them, that was like erasure, that was like finishing, that was like ending something. And they said, no, we're not going to let go of that memory. But they were willing to think about, one of the words they liked was transcendent. How do we transcend? And I think that has to do with change. But I think in post-traumatic growth, which is a growing field, is certainly this idea that we can care for the wound, as Mafe said. We can care for the wound, and we can grow and become stronger and bigger people as a result of that. we'll never forget it, and it will always impact our lives. And so our lives will always be different. But in that difference, how can we make something bigger and better, or something, make ourselves bigger and better? I'm not talking about, material things. And Angela, you are asking so many critical questions in Ethiopia, and there's so much to unpack in that. I think I would just simply say, the more we can ask, where is this already happening at a local indigenized level? And how can we capitalize on that? And when that, and what you're explaining, what you're describing in Ethiopia is the age-old problem of Western and Northern countries just sort of dumping things in, and saying this is peace building programs and projects and stuff, but they're external and they're hoisted upon and they're top down. And over again, we're finding that doesn't work. There's more and more literature coming out that says the local term, localization, and the indigenized processes left to their own devices could possibly be critical ways of change. And I would argue, much of my research, I don't have time to get into it, is around Sierra Leone in West Africa, and the Fambul talk, which is an indigenous process that they not resurrected, but hybridized and started to use as a post-war reconciliation process. And it's had incredible progress. I'm not going to even use the word success, but incredible progress, I believe, in this healing that we're trying to talk about here, and in such a way that Fambul talk is critical to the sustainable peace and reconciliation in West Africa. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned that, thinking again about Ethiopia, one of the things that we've been, that I've been putting on the table with different groups that we've been talking recently is whether, this idea of a national dialogue should be replaced by the idea of how we nurture a national ecosystem of dialogues. Because really, a national dialogue is an exclusive, as you were rightly saying, excludes people. But if you create a national ecosystem of dialogues, then you understand that there are multiple spaces where dialogues are taking place, that they can somehow complement each other. So that could be something useful, and happy to continue talking about this, in a different space. If you wish, just get in touch, and something that we could elaborate further, Angela. But we have 4 hands here, and we are running short of time, and I think it would be really important to hear those comments, questions, So, Doc Leo, you've been waiting for a while. Could you? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really love what everyone is talking about, and also very much this ecosystem of dialogues that you just mentioned. I think that is an absolutely fantastic idea. My background is actually more in healthcare research, and also I'm dabbling in diplomatics on the side. I'm actually currently helping this new initiative called Diplomats Without Borders as a secretary to the board. And this is actually something that touches on what Andre was saying, because they're creating this as a voluntary service to go international. And they're actually currently recruiting members. They're looking at diplomats, ex-diplomats that have a lot of experience. So I don't know, have a look at it, see if any one of you is interested. I think many of you have absolutely fantastic ideas that they would love to hear as well. So yeah, that was just a quick side note. I'm not on there. I'm helping out as a secretary. So also feel free to send me a note as well. But I actually wanted to touch on a few things that have been said by everyone up till now. One thing was the healing truth. And I think actually everyone who has spoken now has gotten very close to giving an answer to that without actually realizing. And I wanted to touch on one of the things just to explain a little bit of what I think it is. I think, for example, Mafe mentioned how difficult it is to process things when you don't know what has happened to the victims or what the story is. So I think part of the healing truth is actually, that is where the healing truth is missing. I think the healing truth is in a situation where you get an explanation of what has happened. And in that way of getting an explanation of the truth, you are getting an acknowledgement of your suffering. You're getting an acknowledgement and recognition in a way of what has happened. That would be for me the healing truth. I think it is much easier to process what has happened and accept yourself. And I wouldn't say find closure, because that is exactly what Carl said, but basically to find a step on to transcend your suffering when you know what has happened. Otherwise, we're very, how do you say that, cognitive human beings, and we will create a million different stories for our suffering, and in a way never be able to know what has happened. And this plays with your head, and I think in a way makes it very difficult for people to transcend, because you're always falling through another narrative that might be the meaning, the reason for why you have suffered in this way. So actually creating that dialogue between different parties creates the opportunity of understanding where the things have happened, have come from, and how, in a way, almost embracing the humanity of the other person, whilst at the same time being recognized for your own humanity as well. So I would kind of say that would be my interpretation as to what the healing truth would be. And in that, I guess it's kind of like Simon says as well, it's a healing process. It's a continuous process of recovery, and what he mentioned was understanding. And I think that is a very, very big part of this. Lastly, there was something else, but I actually think that is the main thing, and I'd like to hand it over to other people because I think everyone's got a lot of interesting things to say. So yeah, that's me. Thank you all very much. It's been amazing.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you so much. Please write the name of the organization. If you could, the link on the chat box, that would be great.
I will do.
And thank you for that contribution. I think it's fantastic to hear that importance of transcendence that you have brought to the table. Karen, over to you. Karen, just in case you're speaking, we cannot hear you, so probably you need to unmute yourself. And yeah, perfect.
Hi, good day. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all. My name is Karen Serwanka, and I currently live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. But I would like to begin with a traditional land acknowledgement. As a settler, I live and work in Treaty Territory Number 1, and those are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Ojibwe, and the Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So this is an important time for us to be talking about reconciliation every day, but to also acknowledge tomorrow is our National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Mm-hmm. And I'm wearing an orange shirt in recognition of all the children that were lost and who experienced the social suffering that you're talking about in the residential schools in Canada. And the tradition of that just briefly began with one of the residential school survivors, Phyllis Jack Webstad, who said when she was taken to residential school, she was forced to remove her clothing, and she was wearing a red shirt, and she couldn't understand why she couldn't continue to wear it. So that's why I'm wearing an orange shirt today. The issue that I want to ask colleagues on the line about is, how can we move forward on reconciliation, or I like the word conciliation that you've mentioned from South Africa, whilst grappling with power imbalances? Mm-hmm. Because I think at the root of what we're talking about is, in order for all of these atrocities to happen, there were tremendous power imbalances. Yes. and violence over people. And I'm wondering if we're beginning to reckon with that sufficiently, because even like the languages we're speaking are colonial languages. The institutions that we're working in are shaped by colonial thought and practices. And I will give as a positive example, at the University of Manitoba, They have developed an OxPeace, a healing and health center that is run by Indigenous leadership, Indigenous doctors, Indigenous vice principal, and there's a clear focus on not only past tradition, but living, evolving traditions and power sharing and anti-racism work. And I think this is where I need to learn more, is how are we grappling with these kind of issues, and a real restoring some kind of a power balance, or in ways that are kind of looking at the roots of how this came about in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That's amazing. And I think that's the reason why for Embrace Dialogue is so important to organize this, because we feel that we're, and you're right, we are from Colombia. Most of the people who have joined Rodeemos el Diálogo are from Colombia, or people who are friends of Colombia who wanted to contribute to peace in Colombia. But the whole idea was we cannot host these sort of things always from the north. I mean, Colombia, Bogota, in the middle of the armed conflict, can also be a space to convince these dialogues and to convene these global dialogues on reconciliation. And this is the reason why it's so important. How do we nurture these sort of things and start deconstructing the colonial, practices that have been imposed on us? So thank you so much for bringing this to the table. MB, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much to Carl. I love the ecosystem idea. It's compelling, it's appealing. As Andre was saying, we love our metaphors. It condenses everything. You spoke about the sun, the rain, the soil, and so on. It's fabulous. But one thing you didn't mention was the intentional dumping of toxic waste in your metaphor. And in geopolitical terms, what we've seen in nation states around the world that we would say are not in conflict is a movement towards tribalism. I'm thinking of Viktor Orban in Hungary. I'm thinking of Bolsonaro in Brazil. I'm thinking of the recently elected Prime Minister in Italy. So my question is, do you think that addressing this issue in so-called peaceful societies is actually a task for peace builders and people working in reconciliation now? Because if you live in Sierra Leone, or you live in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or you live on the borders of Pakistan and India, you may be watching these so-called peaceful countries, and what you see exemplified is a tribe. It's actually not a critical mass towards peace building and reconciliation. It is the literal dumping of toxic waste into the ecosystem. So I wonder if you could help us understand whether so-called peaceful societies need to be addressed by this community of peace builders in the same way as you talk about countries which are at war. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Mbe. Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna give the chance to Rola.
Hello. So my name is Rula, and I used to be a student at the Winchester University, in peace building and reconciliation. So I'm in Lebanon. I'm a Lebanese. We work in many things regarding reconciliation and peace building. So my question or my thoughts are, and what I've been seeing, we work mainly with the youth and the new generation. So just a quick thing about Lebanon, we had war and we had civil war for the past 30 years. And then it's more like our country is like a post-conflict country, right? So what I've been seeing is that the new generation is more open toward reconciliation, is more open toward talking with each other, much more than the first generation that has been in war or were at war, were during the war, sorry. Now, the way I understand healing truth is basically how we approach peace and peace building. For us is through, we do mental health, psychosocial support, and peace building program at schools from younger age to older age. It's not a project, it's not just a one-time session, it's like a whole year that grows a year after a year after a year. But what I've been seeing is that the healing that youth are in need is mainly healing of what's happening in their normal life and in their day-to-day life. And once that is have the space to talk, have the space to process, have the space to get skills, but in the same time try to practice, they will be more open to be with people who are from different religions, because mainly our conflict is quite faith conflict. Now, through another thing, once I feel like it's on personal level, it can grow more onto collective level, or more into like person to a person. So my question here, with reconciliation be possible with first generation, or is it more like something our effort should be more toward like the new generation or the youth, or yeah, basically. And especially in Lebanon, we've been seeing lots of movement of youth rising against like the corruption, against all what's happening. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Rula, and very good to see you here. Simon, I'm gonna give you the chance to talk now and to hand over to you, and then we will go to Carl.
I'm going to be very brief. All I want to say is that I think these metaphors are a really helpful thing for us to use in thinking about the complexity of reconciliation. Those of us who've heard Jama Egel from Somalia, Sudan, Somalia, yeah, talk about the use of the image of this milk churn, the Han, as a way of getting people to understand reconciliation and its complexities in there. I think it's incredibly impressive. And I think, Carl, this ecosystem idea is another of these really big metaphors from which we can gain a huge amount by thinking about how the different elements of an ecosystem. An ecosystem, everything depends on everything else. A tiny change to one thing can bring out a big change elsewhere. We have this enormous diversity of roles in addition to the predators, and we have to also have the bacteria. We have to have alongside the symbiosis. You've also got to have the scavengers. So you can go too far down this line and it becomes ridiculous. But I think Lederach shows us that this kind of imaginative rethinking of our assumptions by using metaphors could be incredibly fruitful in terms of developing these really interesting ideas that you're now developing. And I'd love to be part of that. Anyway, but thank you so much. Really stimulating.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And thank you, everyone. I mean, we have been going on for 8 more minutes now, but it got momentum, this dialogue, and we cannot stop things just like that. So I really want to now hand over to Carl, just to hear a sort of final reflection of where is your thought process now after this amazing, I believe, hour and a half of engaging with people from Canada, Colombia, different countries. So where are you, Carl?
Thank you, Andre, and thank you for everyone. And I realize we've gone over time, so I'm going to be as brief as possible. I'm going to start with MB's analogy, adding to the analogy of the sort of structural violence of toxic dumping in an ecosystem. I mean, there's a fascinating concept, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, this is when organized violence comes into an ecosystem too, and is sustained for decades and decades. It has a toxic effect, and to your question right away, I am a strong believer in structural violence. And so I think many of our supposed, as you call them, peaceful societies are in fact dealing with a great level of structural violence. And so I'll speak from my own country, the United States. As you are fully aware, you know, we're in a constant battle around the sort of toxic, authoritative, repressive, oppressive government structures that are wanting to be imposed or being utilized in our system. And I consider this a form of structural violence. And I think it goes back to, it has many roots. I think we have to be very honest about that. But one of those roots in US history is that we have never taken responsibility for the violence that established this country. The violence against the indigenous people, which is descriptive of genocide, and the 100 years of slavery, the enslavement of African peoples. And so until we begin to have truth-telling of some sort in our country, we're also going to be wrestling with low levels of structural violence, or high levels of structural violence, and we are in social violence and otherwise. And so I think you're exactly right. And this lends itself to Canada and our sister who spoke about power. Absolutely. Power is absolutely critical in this conversation. And not only analyzing the power and describing the power, but being honest about how we're going to share that power. The ownership, the decision-making, and the redistribution of resources all tie into recognition. And that recognition ties into a sense of being human and being dignified as a human being, and therefore also the possibility for reconciliation. And so there's much work to be done on the same issue that you have brought to our attention in Canada, here in the United States, also our Native American residential school system, which there's schools was a tremendous devastation for our indigenous peoples. I want to say this on a positive note. In Lebanon, thank you. I would put Lebanon also in that, in there's so much, as you say, a post-war, there's so much of the history that hasn't been dealt with, and this is a challenge. And so I think we need to be calling all of our governance structures to account as much as we can. And in this time when it seems like peace building and reconciliation is in a very vulnerable, fragile place globally, I think we have to resort back to how do masses of people mobilize and make their voice known. And so at the same time that we're seeing the fragility of peace building and reconciliation, we are seeing a rise in protest mobilization across the globe. And I think we need to begin to understand that as not separate, but part of the restructuring of power and the sort of shaking up of the foundations to prepare for reconciliation. And so there's a lot we can discuss, provided we keep it at the level, that we talk about nonviolent strategic action and nonviolent mobilization. And I think your mention of the youth from Lebanon, I would say that across the board. I think we have to focus on the next generation. And many of these movements that I'm talking about have sprung from the next generation, saying we want to live a different way than what you are passing to us. And I want to end on a positive note. I think, as Andre said, there is so much incredible innovation and challenge. I'm not glorifying it, but innovation happening in Colombia. That Colombia is leading the way. And we have much to learn from them in the world. And I would say the same for Sierra Leone. It's leading the way in this process. And there's many stories we could tell about that, but I don't have the time. And so you folks are the heroes. You are doing the work. And I want to thank you for the vital work that you are doing. And thank you for this opportunity to have this dialogue. I'll send it back to you, Andre.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. I think trying to bring this beautiful space to an end is very difficult, but I think we have put lots of things on the table here, and hopefully for those of you who came with some ideas now are going to leave this space thinking about new things, having new thoughts. Hopefully you felt part of creating a shared meaning together during the last hour and a half. In the case of the importance of reconciliation, as Carl was saying, and I think the importance of these dialogues is not to just come here once and share this, but trying to sustain this dialogue going, because there are many loose ends that need to be taken with different people, with different contexts, with different regions, with different case studies. As Rula was talking, I was thinking about the fourth critical dialogue on reconciliation we did with Camilo Villarreal, one of the members of Rodeemos el Diálogo in Colombia, who led a project called To Be History. And it was run by 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds. They decided to run this, and it's not good enough only to bring to the curriculum the idea of the past and dealing with the past, but we need to start bringing together kids in Bogota from different schools, from privileged backgrounds and poor backgrounds together to think about what does it mean to build a different history and to understand the past in a different way. And so this shows the importance of spontaneity in peace, in reconciliation. And I think that's the beautiful part of the ecosystem, of the social ecology of reconciliation that Carl is talking about. And I know that we didn't really talk a lot about that, but I think for an ecosystem to exist and to be alive and to be healthy, there is a large degree of spontaneity, and these things emerge over time. And it's just like when we think about, how is it that life keeps going in this planet? It's by trial and error. It's through mutations and natural selection. And that includes these small transformations that sometimes happen out of nowhere that creates the possibility of social change. So thank you so much. With those ideas you have put on the table, Simon, Rula, Mbe, Leonie, all of you, Mafe, all of you, Angela, all of you have contributed, Karen, all of you have contributed to make this a very enriching stream of meaning that has cut across all of us, I hope. So if you allow me, I would like to ask you to give a round of applause to all of you and to Carl for participating in this space now that we are closing this and bringing it to an end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carl.